Well, hey there, and thank you for joining me on today's live stream. In case you missed it, this week's episode of the Driven Woman Entrepreneur Podcast was my conversation with Lisa Mulligan. Now, Lisa Mulligan has lived in multiple countries. She has lived in Australia, where she's from, New Zealand, Singapore, and the UK. She has not lived here in the US or in Canada, where many of my podcast listeners are. But something that really drew me to having a conversation with Lisa. In fact, we had two conversations because I interviewed her for the Driven Woman Entrepreneur podcast, and she interviewed me for her podcast, which is called A Dog Called Diversity. Lisa Mulligan is a diversity and inclusion consultant who works with companies all over the world on how to be more diverse and inclusive in the workplace. Now, what was interesting is when I decided that I wanted to interview someone in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, I originally thought I'm going to look for a woman of color because here in the US, we have many different races, many different cultures, many different cultural backgrounds, and yet most of the power and decision making is still in the hands of one specific group, which is middle-aged white males. However, when I learned about Lisa's background of working in a number of different countries, I thought we can have a very interesting conversation, even though we are both white females. Now, I am making an effort to have more diverse guests. And if there is a woman of color that you think would be a perfect fit for the Driven Woman Entrepreneur podcast, please hit me up. You can DM me on LinkedIn at Coach Diane Wingert, or you can email me at diane@dianewingertcoaching.com. And remember, Diane is Diann. I decided to focus our podcast episode on a part of our conversation, and I want to bring all of it together for you and also bring in some of my own personal experience and some of the experiences that I have heard about from my clients with respect to diversity and inclusion. Even though here we are, 2023, like almost halfway into 2023, and women make up half of the workplace, we are still not represented in all the places where we should be. This is not just in traditional male-dominated industries, but for example, in the mental health industry where I come from, and it is an industry as well as a profession, most of the frontline workers, if you will, the case managers, the therapists, people who are actually providing the services to the clients, to the beneficiaries, most of those positions are filled by women. If you have ever looked for a therapist and you would like a male therapist, they're harder to find because there frankly aren't that many of them. But what you will find is the top positions in the industry are held by the few men in the industry. Every agency that I worked for, every hospital department that I worked for, every place, and in a few places I was the top person, but I got laid off in one and I got harassed in another. So I think the power balance still leaves a lot to be desired. Now, certainly in male-dominated industries, where Lisa comes from, and some of my other friends, Rhonda Glynn in Trinidad and Tobago came from aviation, a male-dominated industry. Another friend of mine, Misha Gubig, came from a male-dominated industry in automotive. But even in female-dominated industries like mental health, like teaching, like nursing, the top spots are in the hands of men. So do we need more diversity, equity, and inclusion on gender? Yes, we do. Do we also need more diversity, equity, and inclusion on race, ethnicity, culture? Yes. How long someone's family has been in the country. We need more diversity in terms of, are you an immigrant? Are you second generation, third generation, and so forth? We need more diversity, equity, and inclusion on people's orientation. We need more queer people in positions of power, in positions of leadership, in positions of authority. We need people who have physical differences as well. We need people who are neurodivergent. And this is something I will talk about until I can't talk anymore. Most organizations like to say they are progressive. Most organizations, at least in their mission statement, at least in their public-facing brand, public relations, say they're progressive, say they strive for excellence, say they value inclusion. But if you look at who's doing what in those organizations, it tells a different story. So I think if organizations actually want to improve, actually want to evolve, actually want to progress, they need more diverse voices, because how is the change supposed to come in an echo chamber filled with the people who have already been making decisions for decades, even centuries? It's not going to happen. We have to think outside the box, which means we have to get outside the box and invite others into the box, or better yet, get rid of the frickin' box. So some of my conversation with Lisa Mulligan for this week's podcast episode centered around ways that women tend to be excluded, discriminated against, criticized, sidelined, overlooked in organizations of all sizes, all industries, and irrespective of whether they are male-dominated, female-dominated, or an equal mix of all the genders. We specifically talked about tall poppy syndrome. Now, it may be a term that you're not familiar with, but it exists in every country. The Australians, the Aussies, are the ones who coined the term. And if you haven't heard it before or you're not familiar, keep watching. I'm going to explain it. You don't have to Google it or go look it up or go down the research rabbit hole. Tall poppy syndrome essentially refers to this: people that are driven, people that are ambitious, people that are intelligent, people who have original ideas, people who are assertive, and people who want to contribute all those assets to the organization they work for may be perceived by others as a tall poppy. The rationale behind this goes all the way back to childhood. If you were a smarty pants kid, if you were, and some of us remember being called a smartass much sooner in life than it was appropriate to use the ASS term to any child. But the common thinking is, if you stand out above the others, you're a show-off, you're a know-it-all, you're a smartass, and you make other people look bad and feel bad. It took me decades to learn that I am actually not responsible for how other people feel about me, and I'm definitely not responsible for how they feel about themselves in comparison to me. But most women and some men and non-binary folk have been conditioned from childhood to believe that if you stand out, if you are smarter, if you are faster, if you are more clever, if you are more creative, if you figure out the answer to the teacher's question quicker, and you let that be known, you're a know-it-all, you're a show-off, you're a braggart, you're a blowhard, you are conceited, you're a narcissist, and nobody will like you, and you make other people look and feel bad. That is a whole cluster F for a child who's probably simply bright, loves learning, and needs to share what they're learning to be engaged in the learning process. That certainly was true of me. So the tall poppy syndrome is That person is standing out too much. That person is too clever, too outspoken, too creative, too whatever. They stand out above the rest of the group. We have to cut them down. Apparently, if you are growing poppies, you want them all to be at the same height. And if one of them is taller than the others, you literally cut its head off so they can all be the same. Now, I would call this conforming to the norm. I would also call it creating a culture of mediocrity. Because in any organization, any organization, any grouping of human beings of any size, there are always going to be those that are quicker, faster, stronger, braver, more confident, more talented, more experienced, more gifted, more capable, faster. There are always going to be people who are at the head of the pack. There will always be people who will be at the back of the line, who will be slower, who will be less talented, who will be less experienced, or who simply need more time to get the job done. Doesn't mean they're less valuable, and they don't deserve to be called out and shamed any more than the people who stand above. So when it comes to creating a culture of diversity and inclusion, what we actually want is to invite people at every point on the spectrum to participate, to contribute, to have their voice and their thoughts and their values part of the conversation. That doesn't happen in most workplaces. Even those who have stated an intention to be a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization. In fact, most companies at least imply that because they understand that's the direction the culture is going, and they think it makes them look better. Think about the irony of this for a moment, if you would. Companies are stating that they have a policy and practices of diversity, equity, inclusion because they want to look better than they actually are. And yet, of that. Think about the hypocrisy of that, the audacity of that. We value diversity, equity, and inclusion, but if you happen to be a smart cookie, we're going to chop your head off and slam you down. Now, I work with a lot of gifted women, and I work with a lot of women who are gifted and also have ADHD traits. They are twice exceptional, so they're twice as likely to have heard this kind of feedback and to have internalized it. Over time, if they don't leave organizational life and start their own business, which many of us do because we feel that organizations are inhospitable for people who are different, then at the very least, they will contribute less. They will speak up less. They will offer their original, out-of-the-box, creative, brilliant problem-solving and brainstorming capacities less because it's not safe. I mean, if you know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, most people have at least heard of it. We have to meet our basic need for safety before we can attempt to meet other needs. So let's say you are a clever person. You are a driven woman who's working in an organization. You have really good ideas, and maybe you don't want to be an entrepreneur. Maybe you really like being a contributor in an organization, but you don't get invited to meetings where decisions are being made, even though people at your level are there. Other people at your level are there. When you do speak up, you get the side eye, you get the eye roll, you get the glancing at the watch, you get the or you get nothing. You get crickets. How many times are you going to continue to speak up, speak out, and contribute your brilliance under those conditions? Well, unless you are a masochist, not very long. So you're either going to leave that organization and probably encounter the same thing in the next one, or you're going to stay and contribute less. In my opinion, that's one of the biggest losses to both you and the organization, because when you are not allowed to share your brilliance, you're less motivated, you're less engaged, you're probably a little less brilliant, because creativity needs to be fostered in order to continue showing up easily, readily, naturally. You have to feed the beast, if you will. You have to exercise the creativity muscle. And if you don't feel a sense of safety to do that in the organization you're in, you might stay. But in a way, it's kind of like staying in an abusive marriage. You're still there, but you're not all there. And everybody loses. You lose because you're not fully expressed. And they lose because chances are you are the only person in that room who is capable of coming up with a truly original, disruptive idea that will actually move the organization, or at the very least, the conversation forward. And this is why I think we need to do better when it comes to diversity and inclusion. As a culture, globally, we need to stop telling children, teens, and young adults that their success is causing harm to other people. It's not. If you are intimidating to someone, that is a them problem, not a you problem. If you are the most clever person in the room, chances are you need to migrate to a different room. And if you are always the most clever person in every room, you might need to go out on your own as a consultant of some sort, so that you can actually be compensated for your brilliance by companies who actually welcome it. And this is an interesting thing as well. Oftentimes, people who are entrepreneurs, people who have these brilliant ideas and get shut down because they're a tall poppy, they get shut down again and again and again and again in various workplaces. They may actually thrive and be wildly successful as consultants, and might even be hired by the same company that could not tolerate their brilliance when they were an employee. Now, this may seem totally perverse, totally illogical, but I think it kind of makes sense when you consider that being in an organization and standing out from the others in the organization is kind of like being the smart one in the family. And frankly, this is where most of people censoring themselves, masking their brilliance, holding themselves back, and shrinking to fit the circumstances, this is where it begins, in the family. You know, family culture helps prepare people or sets them up for failure in future work culture. Because if you were a smart kiddo, you were a quick learner, you were really creative, you just simply had the best ideas, or you just figured out the answer faster than every other kid in the room. Even if you were in the gifted program, you probably got your head cut off by the teacher, by the teacher's aide, by other kids, even your own parents. People who stand out in a positive way are usually not popular. You might be admired, you might be respected, you might have people feel that you are really impressive and they hold you in very high regard. But that doesn't mean they like you. That doesn't mean they want to befriend you. That doesn't mean they want to hang out with you after work and go out for drinks. Because we tend to want to surround ourselves with people who are like us. We tend to want to sort of, you've heard the expression, water seeks its own level. We tend to surround ourselves with people who are about at our level. And yet, if you've heard this once, you've probably heard it 100 times. Don't be the smartest person in the room. Seek rooms where there are people who are smarter than you, who know more than you, who are more experienced than you. Because those rooms are places where you can grow. Now, if you've already been shut down, cut down, shut up, dismissed, silenced, oppressed, overlooked, disregarded, I am so sorry that you've experienced that. And I sincerely hope that you have not internalized it as evidence that you just need to shut the F up and stop contributing. I know that's probably the first place that many of us have gone because it just feels too dangerous, too unsafe, and too painful to keep speaking up. But no matter how many times you've had your tall poppy head cut off, the fact remains you have a lot to contribute. So the challenge becomes finding the right places to make that contribution. And sometimes we can actually push back against the culture that we're in and maybe help change it. But if that is your aim, it's going to be very hard to do in isolation. It's going to be very hard to do if you are the only tall poppy in the organization. And there are a lot of people willing to cut you down and shut you up. That's going to be very lonely. It's going to be very isolating. It's going to be very alienating. And it's going to be very strenuous. So if you like an extreme challenge and you want to do that, rock on with your bad self. It's not my job to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. But we all have limited bandwidth. We all only have so many hours to contribute and so many years to contribute. And you might just decide it's not the best use of your precious human life to try to change a culture that doesn't value excellence, that doesn't value originality, that doesn't value progressive ideas. Maybe you really do need to take your ball to another court. The tall poppy syndrome is really just one way that organizations suppress talent and silence originality. It's not the only way. And the whole conversation of diversity and inclusion goes well beyond what I'm sharing with you today. I do encourage you to listen to this week's episode. It's episode 158 of the Driven Woman Entrepreneur Podcast, my interview on tall poppy syndrome, a chat about diversity and inclusion with Lisa Mulligan. I think there's a lot of value there. And we do talk about a number of things beyond tall poppy syndrome. There is also, if you're really into tall poppy syndrome in particular, I recorded an episode of the Driven Woman Entrepreneur Podcast a long time ago. Today is my third podversary. May 19th, 3 years ago, in the early stages of the pandemic, I launched the podcast. And today, the podcast is 3 years old. So I have been producing a weekly episode every week for 3 years. I'm very proud of that. And I'm very proud of how well the podcast has been received, the incredible guests that I have been able to host, the amazing conversations I've been able to have and share, and the fact that we are reaching driven women entrepreneurs all over the world. I'm really excited and also humbled by that. But as driven women, whether we have our own business, we aspire to have our own business, we have a business, and we also work for others, we need to do better to be more inclusive. We need to do better to encourage organizations to diversify, to invite more voices to the table, to the decision-making table, to the brainstorming table, to the future forecasting of the business table. If you are part of any of those conversations, leave room at the table for more diverse people. Everybody wins. And we are not talking about mandates. We are not talking about being woke. We are not talking about the difference between being liberal and being conservative. What we're talking about is the future of business. Businesses that are not diverse internally are not going to be able to compete with businesses that are. The world is a diverse place. And unless you happen to have a brick and mortar local business that serves a local clientele, you need to be part of the global conversation. It's happening everywhere. Maybe a place to start is by visiting Lisa Mulligan's website, The Culture Ministry. If you want to continue this conversation with me personally, whether it's about diversity and inclusion, tall poppy syndrome, or being a neurodivergent person in the workplace who wants to contribute more, but is kind of getting their head cut off, hit me up on LinkedIn at Coach Diane Wingert, or if you want to do it personally, you can send me an email at diane@dianewingertcoaching.com. And remember, Diane is DIANN because, hey, I'm a little bit different. That's all for now. I'll be back next week.